Imagine a city that for over 1,000 years was considered the center of the world. Constantinople, the heir to the great Rome, the capital of the Orthodox faith, a place where Europe and Asia met. It was called Carigrad, the second Rome, the eye of the world. Here, on the shores of the Bosphorus, the fates of nations and empires were decided. But in May 1453, this majestic city became the arena of the last battle of a dying empire. Welcome to our channel. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and give it a like. Thank you for your support and happy listening. To understand the scale of the tragedy, one must imagine what Constantinople was like in its prime. In the 6th century, under Emperor Justinian, it was the largest city in the world, with a population of about 1 million people. For comparison, at that time, Paris had no more than 20,000 inhabitants, and London was a small settlement. Constantinople amazed contemporaries with its splendor. Marble palaces, golden domes of churches, wide avenues decorated with ancient statues. The city's greatest pride was the Hagia Sophia Cathedral, an architectural marvel considered the 8th wonder of the world. Its enormous dome seemed to float in the air without support. Inside the temple, golden mosaics sparkled, and marble of various sorts created an amazing play of colors. Contemporaries wrote that a person entering Hagia Sophia for the first time involuntarily raised their eyes to heaven, thinking that God resided in that place. But the city was famed not only for its beauty. Constantinople was the largest trading center where merchants from all over the known world met. In its harbors, ships from Venice and Genoa, from Crimea and Egypt, from distant India and China were moored. People in the most diverse attire walked the streets. Byzantine aristocrats in silk robes, Arab merchants in white turbans, Russian traders in fur hats, Italian bankers in velvet tunics. The famous Hippodrome, a huge stadium where horse races and circus performances were held, particularly amazed foreigners. 100,000 spectators could simultaneously watch the competitions. Ancient obelisks brought from Egypt and the serpent column from Delphi stood in the Hippodrome. The quadriga, a team of 4 bronze horses, was also located here. It was later taken by the Venetians and installed on St. Mark's Basilica. The story began long before the fatal siege. By the 10th century, only a shadow remained of the once great Eastern Roman Empire. If in the 6th century, under Emperor Justinian, Byzantium stretched from Italy to Egypt, controlled the Balkans, Asia Minor, and North Africa, then now the last emperor ruled almost exclusively Constantinople with its immediate surroundings. The decline began back in the 6th century when the young Arab state attacked the Byzantine possessions in Asia and Africa. Muslim conquerors took Syria, the breadbasket and one of the richest provinces, from the empire. Then Egypt fell, with its immense riches and ancient culture. The empire lost more than half of its population and income, but this was only the beginning. In the 10th century, a new threat came from the east. The Seljuk Turks captured a large part of Asia Minor. The Battle of Manzikert in 1071 became a catastrophe for Byzantium. Emperor Romanos IV was taken prisoner, and his army was routed. After this defeat, the empire never again controlled the interior regions of Anatolia. It seemed that the Crusades should have brought relief to Byzantium, as Western knights were going to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims. They were allies in the struggle against a common enemy. The first 3 crusades indeed helped the empire regain some territories, but the Fourth Crusade became a real disaster. In 1204, the Crusaders turned their swords against Constantinople itself. The formal pretext was the support of one of the contenders for the Byzantine throne, but the true reason was greed. The city was incredibly rich, and the Crusaders were deeply in debt to Venetian bankers. The siege did not last long. The defenders did not expect an attack from their co-religionists and were not properly prepared. When the Crusaders broke into the city, a plunder began that shocked contemporaries with its brutality. Even Muslim chroniclers wrote with horror about what the Christian knights were doing. In the capital of Orthodoxy, the Venetians took everything most valuable from the city. The famous quadriga from the Hippodrome adorned St. Mark's Basilica. Countless works of art, sacred relics, ancient manuscripts were looted or destroyed. Many churches and palaces were burned simply for fun. A contemporary wrote, "Even the Saracens are more merciful than these people wearing the sign of the cross." After the plunder, the empire fragmented into several states. The Crusaders created the Latin Empire in Constantinople. The Byzantines founded new centers in Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus. Although in 1261, Michael VIII Palaiologos managed to recapture Constantinople, the empire could not regain its former power. By the 10th century, Byzantium resembled a sick old man clinging to life, but his strength was waning. The empire was torn by civil wars. The Cantacuzenios fought the Palaiologos. Father fought son, brother against brother. Each such war weakened the state and gave external enemies an opportunity to seize new territories. Especially tragic was the civil war of 1341 to 1347 between John V and John VI Cantacuzenios. Both sides attracted foreign allies: Serbs, Bulgarians, Turks, and Genoese. The country was devastated. Cities were destroyed. The population fled or died of hunger and disease. It was during this time that Ottoman troops first appeared in Europe. John Cantacuzenios invited Turkish detachments to fight his opponents. This was a fatal mistake. The Turks saw the weakness of the Byzantines, appreciated the wealth of European lands, and decided to stay forever. In 1354, they captured the fortress of Gallipoli on the European shore of the Dardanelles, the first Ottoman possession in Europe. From that moment, Turkish expansion into the Balkans became unstoppable. They captured Adrianople, defeated the Serbs at Kosovo Field, and subjugated Bulgaria. By the beginning of the 15th century, Byzantium was surrounded by Ottoman possessions on all sides, like an island in the Turkish Sea. The empire's economic situation was catastrophic. The trade routes that had brought enormous profits for centuries were now controlled by the Italian republics and the Turks. Byzantine merchants could not compete with the Venetians and Genoese, who had better ships, more capital, and an extensive network of trading posts. Constantinople's population had decreased from 1 million in its best times to 50,000 by the mid-15th century. Entire neighborhoods stood empty. Palaces turned into ruins. Churches were closed due to a lack of parishioners. Travelers wrote that there were more gardens and vegetable patches in the city than houses. Residents grew vegetables right on the streets. But even in such a dire state, Constantinople retained remnants of its past grandeur. Theodosian walls still inspired respect in enemies. This triple line of fortifications, built in the 5th century, was considered impregnable. The outer wall was 12 m high, the middle 8 m, and the inner 5 m. Between them were deep moats, and every 50 m, powerful towers rose. Throughout its history, the walls fell only once, in 1204. And even then, thanks to betrayal and the unexpectedness of the attack, all other sieges broke against these fortifications. Avars, Persians, Arabs, Russians, Bulgarians, all of them retreated, unable to overcome the famous walls. But time took its toll, and by the 15th century, a weapon appeared before which even the strongest fortress walls could not withstand. This weapon was artillery, a new type of armament that revolutionized warfare. And here, a man whose name is forever associated with the fall of Constantinople enters our story. Urban was the name of the Hungarian engineer who created the weapon that decided the fate of the great city. Little is known about his origin. Some sources call him Hungarian, others Wallachian, or even German. One thing is clear: he was an outstanding master of artillery, one of the best specialists of his time. In 1452, Urban arrived in Constantinople and offered his services to Emperor Constantine. The engineer promised to create cannons of such power that no enemy could approach the city. He spoke of his plans to create huge bombards capable of destroying any fortifications. The emperor listened to the master's proposal with interest. Constantine understood perfectly that traditional methods of defense were no longer sufficient against modern armies. The new weapon could equalize the forces of defenders and attackers. But when Urban named the price for his services, the emperor was horrified. The treasury of Byzantium was empty. The empire owed huge sums to Venetian and Genoese bankers. The population was burdened with unbearable taxes, but even this was not enough to maintain the army and navy. Constantine simply did not have the money to pay for the expensive production of artillery. Urban waited for a response for several days, but gradually realized that the Byzantine emperor could not finance his projects. Then the engineer made a decision that changed the course of history. He left Constantinople and headed for the Ottoman court in Adrianople. Sultan Mehmed II was the complete opposite of the Byzantine emperor. He was only 20 years old, but he had already proven himself to be a decisive and ambitious ruler. The young Ottoman Sultan dreamed of becoming the conqueror of Constantinople and was ready to spend any amount of money to achieve this goal. When Urban presented his proposals, Mehmed immediately recognized their importance. The Sultan understood that Constantinople could not be taken by conventional means. Its fortifications were too strong, and too many unsuccessful attempts had been made in the past. The new weapon could change the balance of power. Mehmed not only agreed to pay the requested sum but also exceeded it several times over. He provided Urban with all the necessary materials, the best assistants, convenient workshops. The Sultan personally oversaw the work and demanded regular reports on the progress made. Urban created several cannons of various sizes, but the most famous was the huge bombard, named the Basilica. It was a monstrous weapon that struck contemporaries with its size. The barrel length reached 8 m. The diameter of the bore was 75 centimeters, and the weight of the stone projectile was up to 600 kilograms. Imagine this weapon. The barrel was cast in bronze using a special technology that Urban kept a strict secret. Transporting the cannon required 70 oxen and 200 men. The convoy stretched for several kilometers and moved at a speed of no more than 3 kilometers per day. But the most surprising were the characteristics of the Basilica. A stone projectile weighing 600 kilograms could fly over 1.5 kilometers and penetrate a wall up to 3 m thick. During tests, the roar of the shot was heard at a distance of 15 kilometers, and the shockwave broke windows in houses many kilometers around. However, this formidable weapon had serious drawbacks. After each shot, the barrel had to be cooled with water and oil. Otherwise, the metal could not withstand the next volley. The recoil was so strong that the cannon was thrown out of position and had to be remounted. The Basilica could fire no more than 7 shots a day. In addition, the weapon was extremely capricious to maintain. The slightest inaccuracy in the dosage of gunpowder or the placement of the projectile could lead to the barrel exploding. Urban personally supervised every shot, checked the quality of the gunpowder, and monitored the condition of the metal. He understood that the success of the entire campaign depended on his skill. In addition to the Basilica, Urban created several smaller, but also very impressive, cannons. In total, the Ottoman army had about 70 cannons of various calibers. For that time, this was a huge artillery. No one had ever assembled such a quantity of firearms for the siege of a single city. In the spring of 1453, the Sultan completed preparations for the greatest siege in the history of the Ottoman Empire. 2 years were spent preparing for this campaign. Mehmed gathered an army not only from Turkish lands but also from all his subject territories. The core of the army consisted of janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman Sultan, considered the best in the world. These warriors were recruited at a young age from Christian families, converted to Islam, and raised in a military spirit from childhood. The janissaries were fanatically devoted to the Sultan, had no families, and lived only for war. Their combat qualities were recognized even by enemies. The army of Mehmed had about 12,000 janissaries. They were armed with the best weapons of that time: sabers of Damascus steel, bows made of horn and wood, and many already possessed firearms. The janissaries wore characteristic white caps and were considered invincible in battle. The cavalry component of the army consisted of sipahis, feudal cavalry who served the Sultan in exchange for land grants. Sipahis were excellent horsemen and archers. They could conduct both frontal assaults and exhausting maneuverable battles. There were about 15,000 of them in the Ottoman army. In addition to regular units, the army included bashi bazouks, volunteers from various regions of the empire who went on campaign hoping for rich plunder. These were poorly organized but numerous detachments used for auxiliary operations and initial attacks designed to wear down the enemy. The total strength of the Ottoman army, according to various estimates, ranged from 80,000 to 120,000 men. Constantinople had never seen such an army before. For comparison, during the largest previous siege in 142, the Turks brought no more than 30,000 warriors to the city walls. Mehmed's fleet numbered over 100 vessels of various types. There were large galleys with 30 pairs of oars, fast galleots, and transport ships for supplies. A special pride were several ships armed with cannons, a new word in naval warfare. The fleet was commanded by the experienced Admiral Suleyman Baltoglu, who had already participated in naval battles against the Byzantines and Italians. The fleet's task was to blockade the city from the sea and prevent the delivery of aid by sea routes. On the 6th of April, 1453, This formidable army appeared under the walls of Constantinople. The city's inhabitants, seeing the endless rows of enemy tents, realized they faced a trial unlike any they had ever experienced. The siege began, which would last 53 days and end with the death of a 1,000-year-old empire. The defenders' forces seemed insignificant compared to the besieging army. Emperor Constantine could count on only 7,000 to 8,000 warriors. But what kind of men were they? Each of them understood that they were fighting not just for a city, but for their faith, their culture, for everything that constituted the meaning of their lives. The majority of the defenders were the inhabitants of Constantinople themselves. These were artisans, merchants, priests, who had never held weapons in their hands but were now ready to die for their homes. Old masters forged swords and spears. Women sewed banners and prepared food for the defenders. Children carried water and bandages. There were few professional soldiers. Several hundred Byzantine warriors who remained loyal to the emperor formed the core of the defense. They were descendants of glorious military families, people for whom service to the emperor was a matter of honor and tradition. Many of them came from noble families that had served the empire for centuries. Foreign mercenaries and volunteers played a special role. Several hundred Genoese under the command of Consul Girolamo Giustiniani guarded Galata. Venetian merchants, caught in the siege in the city, also took up arms. There were Catalans, Cretans, and even a few Western knights in the garrison who had arrived as pilgrims but stayed to fight. But the real salvation for the besieged was the arrival of the Genoese condottiere Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. This man deserves a separate story because he became the main hero of the defense of Constantinople. Giustiniani came from a noble Genoese family and had already made a name for himself as a skilled commander. He participated in wars in Italy, defended fortresses on the Black Sea, and was considered one of the best fortification specialists of his time. When he heard rumors about the impending siege of Constantinople, he decided to offer his services to the Byzantine Emperor. In January 1453, 2 Genoese ships entered the Golden Horn harbor. On board were Giustiniani and 700 well-armed soldiers. 400 of them were hired in Genoa itself, and 300 on the islands of Chios and Rhodes. These were all professional warriors, battle-hardened and loyal to their commander. The appearance of Giustiniani made a huge impression on the inhabitants of Constantinople. Finally, a real commander had arrived who could organize the city's defense. Emperor Constantine welcomed the Genoese like a brother and immediately appointed him commander-in-chief of the land defense. Giustiniani immediately got to work. He inspected all the city's fortifications, identified weak spots, and drew up a defense plan. The Genoese condottiere understood that the main danger came from the land walls, especially where they crossed the Lycus stream valley. It was here that the walls were lower and weaker than elsewhere. Giustiniani distributed his forces along the entire defense perimeter but concentrated the main reserves at the street Romanos Gate. He personally led the defense of the most dangerous sector, where he expected the main Turkish attack. His Genoese warriors and the best Byzantine soldiers stood beside him. The condottiere ordered the walls to be strengthened with additional barricades, moats to be dug, and palisades to be erected. He organized round-the-clock duty on the walls and created mobile reserves that could be quickly transferred from one sector to another. Giustiniani understood that with such an imbalance of forces, every advantage of the defenders had to be used. The Genoese paid special attention to artillery. The Byzantines had a few small cannons, but they were significantly inferior to the Turkish guns. Giustiniani ordered them to be installed at the most important points and trained soldiers in the use of firearms. He understood that it was impossible to defeat the Turks in an artillery duel, but it was possible to try to inflict maximum damage. No less important a figure in the city's defense was Emperor Constantine Palaiologos himself. This man was 48 years old when the siege began. He had ruled the empire for only 4 years, but during that time, he proved to be a courageous ruler devoted to his people. Constantine came from a junior branch of the Palaiologos dynasty and was not the direct heir to the throne. He ascended the throne after the death of his brother John VII, who died childless. The new emperor perfectly understood the gravity of the empire's situation but had no intention of surrendering without a fight. From the first days of his reign, Constantine prepared for the inevitable war with the Turks. He strengthened the city walls, collected supplies, and tried to find allies among Western rulers. The emperor even agreed to a union with the Catholic Church, hoping to receive military aid from the Pope, although he knew this decision would be unpopular among his subjects. When the siege began, Constantine proved himself not only a wise ruler but also a brave warrior. He inspected the walls daily, encouraged the defenders, and personally participated in repelling attacks. The emperor fought in simple armor, without any insignia, like an ordinary soldier. His courage inspired everyone else. Contemporaries noted the surprising modesty of the last Byzantine emperor. He lived simply, spending the last funds of the state treasury, not on court luxury, but on the city's defense. Constantine shared all the hardships of the siege with his soldiers, ate the same food, slept on the same beds, and faced the same dangers. Among the city's defenders were other notable figures. Theophilos Palaiologos, a relative of the emperor, commanded the defense of the sea walls. This sector was considered less dangerous but required constant attention due to the threat from the sea. Theophilos organized patrols of the harbor and prevented a surprise attack by the Turkish fleet. Dimitrios Kantakaouzenos, representing another noble Byzantine family, was responsible for the defense of the northern part of the land walls. Here the walls were higher and stronger, but Kantakaouzenos did not relax, understanding that the Turks could try to break through anywhere. The clergy played a special role in the defense. Patriarch Gregory of Constantinople conducted prayers, blessed soldiers, and maintained the morale of the population. Many priests and monks took up arms and fought alongside the laity. They believed they were defending not just a city, but the Orthodox faith from Muslim conquerors. Women also contributed to the city's defense. They prepared food for the defenders, cared for the wounded, and carried ammunition to the walls. Some even participated in combat, shooting bows and crossbows, and pouring boiling oil on the heads of the attackers. Byzantine chroniclers wrote with admiration about the courage of the Constantinopolitan women. Children and adolescents also did not stand aside. They served as messengers, watched enemy movements, and helped the wounded. Many boys, barely reaching 14 to 15 years of age, begged to be given weapons and placed on the walls. The entire life of the city was subordinated to one goal: to withstand the enemy's superior forces. On the 12th of April 1453, the first shot of the Basilica rang out. A huge stone projectile struck the Theodosian wall and destroyed a section of the ancient fortification almost to the ground. The sound was so loud that it was heard by villagers within a radius of 15 kilometers. In Constantinople itself, people fell to their knees in terror, thinking that the end of the world had come. But this was only the beginning of a daily nightmare that would last for almost 2 months. Every day, Turkish cannons bombarded the city walls with hundreds of stone projectiles. The roar of the cannons did not cease from dawn to dusk. The ancient walls, which had defended the city from enemies for 1,000 years, crumbled under the blows of the new weapon. Residents of houses located close to the walls suffered particularly hard. Stone fragments flew for hundreds of meters, piercing the roofs and walls of dwellings. Many families were forced to abandon their homes and move further into the city. The streets were piled with debris from destroyed buildings, but the worst was the psychological impact of the continuous bombardment. People could not sleep, children cried from horror, and the elderly died of heart attacks. It seemed as if the earth itself trembled under the blows of the Turkish cannons. Many residents began to leave the city, despite the emperor's ban. However, the defenders showed remarkable resilience. As soon as a Turkish projectile breached a gap in the wall, the Byzantines immediately began to repair the breach. They worked around the clock, under fire, risking their lives. The breaches were filled with earth and stones, reinforced with wooden beams and sandbags. Giustiniani organized this work with remarkable efficiency. He created special brigades that were on duty at each dangerous section of the wall. As soon as a breach appeared, workers immediately began to repair it. By morning, the destroyed section was usually restored, although not as solidly as before. Various materials were used for these works. Stones were taken from destroyed buildings, earth from city parks and cemeteries, wood from houses and churches. Even marble statues and columns were used to reinforce the walls. The entire city turned into one large construction site. The defenders of the most dangerous sector near the street Romanos Gate in the Lycus Valley fought particularly heroically. It was here that the Sultan concentrated his main artillery. It was here that the main assaults of the Janissaries were directed. The walls here were destroyed to the ground, but the defenders stubbornly clung to every stone. The Turks launched regular assaults, trying to break through the gaps in the wall. The first serious attack took place on April 18. Bashi bazooks and regular infantry went on the offensive. Despite their numerical superiority, the Turks could not gain a foothold on the walls. The defenders met them with a dense fire from crossbows and small cannons. Particularly effective was Greek fire, an incendiary mixture that was a secret weapon of the Byzantines. This mixture, based on oil and sulfur, burned even on water and struck terror into the enemy. The defenders poured Greek fire on the heads of the attackers, turning them into living torches. But the Turks had one important advantage. They could afford to suffer heavy losses. After each unsuccessful attack, Mehmed threw new detachments into battle. For the defenders, however, each fallen warrior was an irretrievable loss. Their forces dwindled day by day, and there was nowhere to expect reinforcements. By the end of April, it became clear that Constantinople could not be taken by simple assaults. Then the Sultan decided to resort to trickery. On April 22, the city's inhabitants witnessed an event that seemed impossible. At dawn, they saw Turkish ships in the waters of the Golden Horn, the very bay that was considered reliably protected from enemies. How did this happen? The entrance to the Golden Horn was blocked by a powerful chain that prevented enemy ships from entering the bay. This chain was stretched between two towers. One was in Constantinople, the other in Galata. Many considered this barrier insurmountable, but Mehmed came up with a brilliant solution. On his orders, a road of greased logs was built across the Galata hill. This road led from the shore of the Bosphorus to the shore of the Golden Horn and was about 2 kilometers long. Along this wooden causeway, the Turks moved their ships around the chain. The operation was carried out overnight in complete secrecy. 70 Turkish vessels of various sizes were transported over land with the help of thousands of men and hundreds of oxen. By morning, they were already sailing in the waters of the bay, to the astonishment and horror of the city's defenders. This operation entered military history as one of the most daring and unexpected. No one had ever dared to take such a step before. The transfer of a fleet overland required enormous effort and precise planning, but the result exceeded all expectations. Now the city was completely blockaded from the sea. The appearance of the Turkish fleet in the Golden Horn had serious consequences for the city's defense. Now the defenders had to guard not only the land walls but also the sea fortifications, which were previously considered safe. The already small garrison had to be stretched even thinner. In addition, this event had a strong psychological impact on the besieged. Many perceived the appearance of Turkish ships in the bay as a bad omen. It seemed that the Turks were capable of any miracle, that even the laws of nature were powerless against them. Emperor Constantine and Giustiniani did not lose heart and decided to strike back. They developed a plan for a night attack on the Turkish fleet using Greek fire. Several Christian ships were to stealthily approach the enemy vessels and set them ablaze. The operation was scheduled for the night of April 28. The Venetian captain Giacomo Coccolo led this desperate attempt. His ships tried to break through to the Turkish fleet under the cover of darkness, but the operation failed due to betrayal. The Genoese from Galata, who had formerly maintained neutrality, warned the Turks about the impending attack. When the Christian ships began their attack, a signal was given from the tower in Galata. The Turkish artillery met the attackers with readiness and sank one of the ships. The failure of this operation further worsened the situation of the besieged. Mehmed ordered the captured Christian sailors to be executed directly in front of the city walls, in full view of the defenders. Constantine responded in kind. He ordered all Turkish prisoners on the walls to be executed. The war became increasingly fierce. By May, the defenders' situation had become critical. Food supplies in the city were running out. The population suffered from hunger. Bread was issued by ration card, and meat became a luxury. Many subsisted only on vegetables from the city's gardens. The wounded suffered particularly. There was a shortage of medicine, few doctors, and practically no hospitals. The wounded were housed in churches and private homes. Many died not from wounds but from infections and exhaustion. The morale of the population worsened every day. People lost hope of salvation. Many families tried to leave the city in small boats. But the Turkish fleet intercepted most of the escapees. Those who remained lived in constant fear and anticipation of disaster. The continuous bombardment was particularly oppressive. Turkish cannons fired not only during the day, but also at night, not allowing the inhabitants to rest. Children could not sleep, women wept, and the elderly cursed the day of their birth. It seemed that the whole world had turned into hell, but even in these conditions, there were people who did not lose faith and courage. Priests conducted services in destroyed churches. Teachers continued to educate children. Artisans forged weapons for the defenders. Emperor Constantine inspected the walls daily, encouraging soldiers and civilians. On the 28th of May, 1453, a service was held in the Hagia Sophia Cathedral, which forever entered history as the last Christian liturgy in this great temple. Under the arches of the cathedral, built by Emperor Justinian almost 1,000 years ago, all who still remained in the dying city gathered. It was an amazing sight. Orthodox and Catholics, Greeks and Italians, noble dignitaries and simple artisans stood side by side. At that hour, differences between denominations and nationalities lost all meaning. Everyone understood that they were witnessing the end of a 1,000-year era. The service was held by the light of thousands of candles, as many of the temple's windows had been bricked up for protection from Turkish projectiles. The golden mosaics shimmered in the flickering light, creating an almost mystical atmosphere. The choir sang ancient Byzantine hymns, and many wept. Listening to these farewell chants, Patriarch Gregory conducted the liturgy with special solemnity, understanding that this might be the last time. He called on those gathered for repentance and prayer, asking God to protect the city and its inhabitants. But in the voice of the old patriarch, there was not only supplication, but also pride in his people, who did not surrender, even in the face of inevitable death. After the service, Emperor Constantine addressed the city's defenders with his final speech. He stood in the center of the temple, surrounded by his commanders and ordinary soldiers. He wore simple armor without any decorations. He wanted to show that he was ready to die as an ordinary warrior. Constantine reminded those gathered of the glorious history of Byzantium, of the feats of their ancestors who had defended this city from all enemies for 1,000 years. He spoke of the sacred sites they protected, of the faith that was dearer than life. The emperor admitted that the forces were unequal, but urged them to fight to the end for honor and dignity. "It is better to die free than to live as slaves," Constantine said, and these words resonated in everyone's heart. The emperor asked for forgiveness from all whom he might have offended with his decisions. He embraced each of his commanders, bid farewell to the patriarch and clergy. Eyewitnesses recounted that many wept while listening to the emperor. Even the stern Genoese condottieri could not hide their tears. Everyone understood that this was a final farewell, that tomorrow many of them would no longer be alive, but no one expressed a desire to surrender or flee. After the emperor's speech, people dispersed to their posts. Some went to the walls, others to hospitals, and some to their families. Many spent the night in prayer, preparing for death. Priests heard confessions of those who wished, and blessed soldiers for their final battle. Meanwhile, in the Turkish camp, final preparations were also underway. Sultan Mehmed held a military council with his commanders and announced that the decisive assault would take place tomorrow. He promised the soldiers 3 days of plunder in case of the city's capture. Such was the ancient custom when besieging fortresses. Mehmed specifically emphasized that whoever first broke into the city would receive rich rewards. The Sultan knew the psychology of his soldiers and understood that the promise of loot would spur their bravery. In addition, he threatened severe punishment for those who showed cowardice in the decisive battle. Throughout the night, preparations continued in the Ottoman camp. The Janissaries checked their weapons and prayed to Allah, asking for victory. The artillerymen prepared the cannons for the final bombardment. Sappers laid mines under the weakest sections of the wall. The Sultan himself rode along the positions, encouraging the soldiers and giving final orders. Mehmed was only 20 years old, but he behaved like an experienced commander. The young Sultan understood the historical significance of the upcoming battle and was determined to see it through to the end. Early in the morning of May 29, the final artillery preparation began. All Turkish cannons opened fire on the walls of Constantinople simultaneously in a furious barrage. The roar of the cannons surpassed everything that had come before. It seemed as if the earth itself was cracking under the blows of metal and stone. The Basilica and other heavy guns concentrated their fire on the section of the wall near the street Romanos Gate. Stone projectiles weighing several hundred kilograms broke through the ancient fortifications, creating huge breaches. The defenders no longer tried to repair the breaches. Turkish artillery destroyed the walls faster than they could be repaired. The bombardment continued until noon. During this time, the walls of Constantinople, which had been considered impregnable for 1,000 years, turned into a pile of ruins. In some places, the breaches were so wide that hundreds of people could pass through them simultaneously. Ancient towers collapsed, and moats were filled with rubble. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the last shot of the Basilica thundered. A huge projectile broke through such a breach in the wall that it resembled a wide gate. Sultan Mehmed understood that the moment for the decisive attack had come. Turkish drums began to beat, and military trumpets sounded along the entire front. The Bashi bazouks, irregular detachments of volunteers from all corners of the Ottoman Empire, were the first to attack. These men were poorly armed and organized, but they were distinguished by fanatical bravery. They were supposed to wear down the defenders and identify weak spots in the defense. Wave after wave of Bashi bazouks rushed at the ruined walls. Many died from the arrows and spears of the defenders, but new detachments continued the assault. Their battle cries merged into a deafening roar that could be heard throughout the city. Behind the Bashi bazouks came the regular units of the Anatolian army, well-trained and armed soldiers. They acted more organized, tried to gain a foothold on the walls, and widen the breaches. These warriors had ladders, hooks, shields, everything necessary for storming a fortress. The defenders met the attackers with a hail of arrows, spears, and stones. Giustiniani personally led the defense of the most dangerous sector near the street, Romanos Gate. The Genoese condottiere was everywhere. He either repelled the Janissary attack, or encouraged wavering soldiers, or personally threw spears at the enemy. Beside him fought Emperor Constantine, who had discarded all his imperial regalia and fought like a common soldier. The last Byzantine emperor held a sword and shield. His armor was stained with his own blood, and that of the enemy. He did not move away from the most dangerous places, setting an example of courage for all the others. The first two waves of Turkish attacks were repelled, but at the cost of huge losses. The defenders became fewer and fewer, and the reserves were depleted. Many sections of the wall were defended by only a few men. There were more wounded than healthy, but even bleeding warriors did not leave their posts. At this critical moment, Mehmed threw his main reserve, the Janissaries, into battle. 12,000 elite warriors advanced to the assault to the sound of military music. Their white caps flashed amidst the smoke and dust. Their battle cries drowned out all other sounds. The Janissaries attacked in a dense formation, shielding themselves with large shields from the defenders' arrows. These professional soldiers knew their business. They did not rush blindly at the walls, but methodically searched for weak spots in the defense. Some detachments carried long ladders, others explosives to undermine the walls. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, an event occurred that decided the outcome of the entire battle. Giustiniani was seriously wounded by a Turkish bullet in the chest and lost consciousness. The wound proved fatal. The bullet pierced his armor and damaged his lung. The Genoese condottiere coughed blood and raved in a fever. Giustiniani's comrades picked up their commander and carried him from the battlefield, hoping to save his life. But their departure at the most critical moment of the battle had a catastrophic effect on the other defenders. Many decided that if an experienced commander was leaving the wall, then the cause was lost. Emperor Constantine pleaded with the Genoese to stay, understanding that their retreat would demoralize everyone else. But Giustiniani was unconscious and could not respond to the emperor's pleas. His men, loyal to their commander, continued to carry the wounded to the ships in the harbor. The departure of Giustiniani and his detachment created a gap in the defense, which the Janissaries immediately exploited. They burst onto the wall through the breach near the street Romanos Gate and began to push back the remaining defenders. The Byzantine soldiers fought desperately, but the forces were too unequal. In these fatal moments, Emperor Constantine showed himself to be a true hero. Seeing that his empire was perishing, he could have tried to escape. Many rulers in similar situations did so, but the last Byzantine emperor chose a different path. Constantine tore off the last signs of imperial dignity, the purple robe and the jewel-encrusted diadem. He did not want the Turks to recognize him and capture him for humiliation. Discarding his regalia, the emperor remained in simple armor, indistinguishable from an ordinary warrior. An empire that has existed for 1,000 years cannot end with the flight of its last emperor, Constantine told his close associates. With these words, he took up his sword and shield and rushed into the thick of the battle, towards where the Janissaries were breaking through the ruined wall. The last moments of Constantine's life are shrouded in legend. Some say he died in hand-to-hand combat with the Janissaries, others that he was stabbed to death with a dagger by an unknown killer. There is a version that the emperor was trampled in the crush of the retreating defenders. Only one thing is known for certain. Constantine Palaiologos died around 4 p.m. on the 29th of May 1453. His body was found only the next day among hundreds of other dead. The last Byzantine emperor was identified only by his purple boots with golden eagles. the only regalia he did not remove. After the emperor's death and Giustiniani's departure, the defenders' resistance quickly crumbled. The Janissaries broke through several sections of the wall simultaneously, and the Turkish troops poured into the city in torrents. The 1,000-year defense of Constantinople ended in a few minutes. What happened in Constantinople after the Turks broke through resembled scenes from the apocalypse. The Ottoman soldiers, maddened by the long siege and thirst for loot, turned the great city into a scene of unprecedented massacre and plunder. The Janissaries and Bashi Bazouks, the most disciplined and most uncontrollable parts of the Ottoman army, were the first to storm the city. The paradox was that the Sultan's elite infantry and the irregular volunteers were equally engaged in looting. The promise of 3 days of freedom unleashed the basest instincts. The streets of Constantinople turned into rivers of blood. Turkish soldiers killed everyone they encountered: men, women, children, the elderly. They spared neither infants nor frail monks. Those who tried to defend their property or the honor of their women were subjected to particular cruelty. Many residents tried to find salvation in churches, hoping for the inviolability of holy places. But the Turks broke in there too, killing worshippers right at the altars. Magnificent temples, decorated with mosaics and frescoes, turned into slaughterhouses. Blood flooded the ancient marble floors, which Byzantine emperors once walked upon. The fate of the monasteries was particularly tragic. Monks and nuns who had dedicated their lives to serving God became victims of particular cruelty. The Turks not only killed them but also desecrated them. Ancient manuscripts, which scribes had worked on for centuries, were used to start fires. But not everyone died in the first hours of the massacre. Many residents were captured for sale into slavery. Turkish soldiers understood that live prisoners were worth more than dead bodies. Therefore, they tried to capture the most valuable people: young women, children, artisans with useful skills. The slave markets in Constantinople, which had traded captives from other countries for centuries, were now filled with the city's own inhabitants. Byzantine aristocrats, who yesterday owned palaces and estates, stood in chains next to ordinary artisans and peasants. Fate had equalized everyone in the face of the conquerors. The plunder of the city was so extensive that it amazed even seasoned Ottoman veterans. Constantinople had accumulated wealth for 1,000 years, and now all of it went to the victors. Soldiers carried gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, silk fabrics, and fur items from houses. Works of art were especially valued. The Turks perhaps did not always understand the artistic value of Byzantine mosaics and icons, but they knew the value of gold and precious stones perfectly well. Many masterpieces were barbarically destroyed for the extraction of precious materials. Ancient libraries suffered particular devastation. Thousands of manuscripts, creations of ancient authors, Byzantine chroniclers, and theological treatises were destroyed or sold at bargain prices. What refugees did not manage to take with them perished in fires or was used to heat baths. The imperial palaces, which for centuries had amazed foreign ambassadors with their splendor, were plundered down to the last jewel. The throne room, where Byzantine emperors were crowned, turned into a warehouse of looted goods. Ancient mosaics were chipped off the walls to extract golden cubes. But the most terrible blow awaited the city's main sanctuary, the Hagia Sophia Cathedral. This temple, which for 1,000 years had been the symbol of the Orthodox world, the center of the empire's spiritual life, now became a witness to the triumph of Islam over Christianity. Around 5 p.m., Sultan Mehmed triumphantly entered the conquered Constantinople. He was only 21 years old, but he had already entered history as the conqueror of the greatest city in the world. The young sultan headed directly for Hagia Sophia to symbolically emphasize his victory. Upon entering the great temple, Mehmed was struck by its beauty. The enormous dome, the golden mosaics, the marble columns. All of this made an indelible impression even on the conqueror. The Sultan understood that he now possessed one of the wonders of the world. The first thing Mehmed did was order an end to the looting in the temple and declared Hagia Sophia a mosque. He performed the prayer in the very place where a Christian liturgy had been celebrated just yesterday. This was a symbolic act, signifying the final victory of Islam over orthodoxy in the ancient capital. The Christian mosaics and frescoes were plastered over with lime or covered with wooden shields. A minaret was added to the dome. The altar was converted into a mihrab, facing Mecca. The ancient temple, dedicated to divine wisdom, became the Muslim mosque of Hagia Sophia. After 3 days, Mehmed ordered an end to the looting and the restoration of order in the city. The Sultan understood that he needed living subjects to govern the new capital. He guaranteed the safety of the remaining inhabitants, and even allowed them to practice Christianity, provided they paid a special tax. Many Byzantine aristocrats who managed to survive the massacre converted to Islam and received high positions in the Ottoman administration. Thus, Byzantine administrative traditions were integrated into the Turkish system of power. Gradually, Constantinople began to transform into an Ottoman city. The Sultan encouraged the resettlement of Muslims from Anatolia and Rumelia here. He also invited artisans and merchants from various countries, promising them privileges and protection. The city, emptied after the massacre, began to be resettled, but the memory of the past was preserved in the stones of the ancient walls, in the ruins of Byzantine palaces, in the churches converted into mosques. The new masters of the city could not completely erase the traces of a 1,000-year history. The Byzantine legacy continued to live under Ottoman rule. What happened to the main participants of this historical drama? The fate of each of them reflected the tragedy of an entire people and era. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, the hero of the defense of Constantinople, was evacuated on a Genoese ship immediately after being wounded. His comrades hoped to save their commander's life, but the wound proved fatal. Giustiniani died of blood loss on the island of Chios, not living to the end of May. The death of the Genoese condottiere became a symbol of the tragedy of the entire Christian world. This man could have been the savior of Constantinople if circumstances had turned out differently. His military talent and personal bravery were recognized even by enemies. Turkish chroniclers wrote about Giustiniani with respect, calling him a worthy opponent. Genoa mourned its hero for a long time. His name became a symbol of military valor and self-sacrifice. In his hometown, a monument was erected to Giustiniani, and his descendants were proud that their ancestor had fought for Constantinople to his last breath. The fate of the Hungarian engineer Urban, the creator of the terrible Basilica, was tragic. According to one version, he died during the siege when his cannon exploded during a shot. The bronze barrel could not withstand the constant overloads and burst, killing its creator and several artillerymen. According to another version, Urban survived the siege but was soon killed by Turkish soldiers during the city's plunder. The soldiers did not know who he was and simply stabbed the foreigner for his clothes and money. Thus died the man whose invention changed the course of world history. There is also a third version, according to which the engineer died of illness shortly after the city's capture. The stress of the siege days, constant worry about his cannons, and responsibility for the battle's outcome undermined his health. Urban died in obscurity, never knowing the fame his invention brought him. Be that as it may, the creator of the Basilica did not live to old age. The man who decided the fate of Constantinople himself became a victim of the events he helped to provoke. History has not even preserved the exact location of his burial. And what happened to the ordinary inhabitants of Constantinople who survived the massacre and plunder? Their fates varied, but almost always tragically. Many Byzantine aristocrats were killed in the first days after the city's capture. The Turks spared the representatives of the old nobility, seeing them as potential organizers of resistance. Some noble families disappeared completely, breaking genealogies that had been maintained for centuries. Those who managed to survive often lost all their property. Palaces and estates passed to Turkish commanders. Libraries and works of art were looted or destroyed. Descendants of Byzantine emperors and nobles turned into beggars. Some aristocrats chose to convert to Islam to save their lives and status. They received new names, Turkish clothes, positions in the Ottoman administration. But the price of such salvation was high. Renunciation of the faith of their ancestors, of thousand-year traditions. The common people, artisans, merchants, peasants, gradually adapted to the new living conditions. The Sultan needed subjects to restore the city, so those who remained alive were not persecuted. Many continued to engage in their crafts, only now under the rule of Turkish rulers. The fate of women and children was particularly harsh. Many of them were captured into slavery and sold in the markets of the new empire. Women were taken into the harems of Turkish nobles. Children were converted to Islam and prepared for service in the Janissary Corps or in the Sultan's palace. But some families managed to escape this fate, hiding in cellars and secret places or fleeing the city in small boats. These people became the first refugees and survivors of Byzantium, carrying the memory of the lost empire to other countries. The Orthodox clergy also suffered heavy losses. Many priests and monks died defending their churches and monasteries. Others were captured or forced to flee. Entire monastic communities disappeared in one day. But Sultan Mehmed understood that he needed to somehow govern the Christian population of the new capital. Therefore, he allowed the election of a new Patriarch of Constantinople, and even granted him certain powers in governing Orthodox communities. The new Patriarch was the monk Gennadius Scalarius, a learned theologian who was against the union with the Catholic Church. This appointment was symbolic. The Sultan showed that he recognized the right of Christians to religious autonomy, but only under his control. Gennadius received a staff and other insignia of patriarchal dignity from the Sultan, but his power was strictly limited. He could ordain priests, resolve religious disputes, collect taxes from Christians, but he had no right to interfere in political matters. Thus began a new era in the history of Orthodoxy. An era of existence under Muslim rule. The Patriarch of Constantinople transformed from the second person in the empire into an official of the Ottoman administration. But even in such a humiliating position, he retained spiritual authority over millions of Orthodox Christians. The brothers of the last emperor, Thomas and Demetrios Palaiologos, ruled the remnants of Byzantium in the Peloponnese. After the fall of Constantinople, they could have tried to restore the empire by declaring themselves legitimate heirs to the throne. But the Ottomans did not give them such an opportunity. In 1460, Turkish troops invaded Mistra, the last capital of Byzantium. Resistance was quickly suppressed, and the despotate of the Morea ceased to exist. Thus, the last remnants of the 1,000-year-old empire disappeared. Thomas Palaiologos fled to Italy with his family and a small relic. The Pope granted him asylum and a small pension. The former despot of the Morea lived in Rome as an exile, dreaming of returning to his homeland, which never happened. His daughter Sophia became one of the most famous women of her time. In 1472, she married Grand Prince Ivan III of Moscow, bringing Byzantine traditions and claims to the inheritance of the lost empire to Russia. Demetrios Palaiologos first entered the service of the Turks, hoping to preserve at least part of his family's possessions, but soon realized the futility of such a policy, and also went to Italy. He died in obscurity, and with him, the male line of the last Byzantine dynasty ended. The fall of Constantinople caused a wave of migration that, in its scale and consequences, resembled the great migration of peoples during the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Thousands of Greeks left their native lands and went in search of a new home in foreign lands. This exodus began even before the city's capture. Many far-sighted people understood that the siege could end in disaster and evacuated their families in advance. Wealthy merchants transferred capital to Western banks. Scholars took manuscripts. Priests saved church relics. But the main wave of refugees flowed from Constantinople in the days and weeks after its fall. People fled on anything that could float, on merchant ships, fishing boats, even on homemade rafts. Many died en route from storms, diseases, or at the hands of pirates. Italy became the main refuge for Byzantine exiles. Venice, Genoa, Florence, Rome. All these cities received new inhabitants who brought with them not only personal tragedies but also priceless knowledge lost in the East. The Venetian Republic was particularly hospitable to the Greeks, as it had maintained trade relations with Byzantium for centuries. Many Greek merchants already had connections with Venetian partners, which facilitated their adaptation. A large Greek community emerged in Venice, which received permission to build its own church. Florence attracted Byzantine scholars and artists. Humanism flourished here, and ancient knowledge, which the Greeks preserved better than anyone else, was valued. Cosimo de' Medici and other patrons generously supported the refugees, understanding the value of their cultural heritage. The Pope himself welcomed the Greek exiles. The Catholic Church saw them as potential allies in the fight against the Turks and hoped to use their knowledge to prepare for a new crusade. Many Greek theologians received cardinal hats and high positions in the Vatican. But the most significant contribution of the refugees was to European culture. They brought with them Greek manuscripts, works by Plato, Aristotle, Plutarch, which were known in the West only in Latin translations or were not translated at all. Imagine, European scholars suddenly gained access to the original texts of ancient philosophers in their original language. It was like discovering new continents in the realm of knowledge. Greek manuscripts were studied, translated, and commented upon. They gave a powerful impetus to the development of humanist philosophy. The revival of Platonism was particularly important. In the Middle Ages, Aristotle was considered an irrefutable authority. His philosophy was adapted to Christian theology, but now Europeans discovered Plato, a philosopher who looked at the world and man differently. The Platonic Academy in Florence, founded by Cosimo de' Medici under the influence of Greek scholars, became the center of a new philosophical movement. Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and other humanists developed a new concept of man as a free and creative being. These ideas had a profound impact on the art of the Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael drew inspiration not only from ancient models but also from humanist philosophy, which placed man at the center of the universe. The influence of Byzantine refugees also extended to the development of science. European scientists gained access to Greek mathematical and astronomical works that were unknown in the West. This contributed to the scientific revolution of the 15th–17th centuries. Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler, in their discoveries, relied not only on their own observations but also on the achievements of ancient and Byzantine scientists. Copernicus's heliocentric system was partially based on the ideas of ancient Greek astronomers, whose texts became available thanks to the Greek refugees. The religious consequences of the fall of Constantinople were also significant. European theologians gained access to the works of the Greek Church Fathers, which allowed them to better understand the early Christian tradition. This became one of the sources of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther and other reformers used Byzantine authors in their critique of the Catholic Church. They argued that a return to the sources, both biblical and patristic, would help purify Christianity from later distortions. Erasmus of Rotterdam published the Greek text of the New Testament, which was a revolution in biblical studies. European theologians were able to study the Holy Scriptures in the original, not in the Latin translation of the Vulgate. This led to a revision of many church dogmas. The fall of Constantinople also changed the political map of Europe. The Ottoman Empire became a great power that threatened the very heart of the Christian world. The Turks reached the walls of Vienna, conquered Hungary, and dominated the Balkans. This forced European rulers to unite against a common threat. The Holy League, the Holy Roman Empire, Venice, Poland, all of them participated in wars against the Turks at different times. The struggle against Ottoman expansion became one of the main factors in European politics, but at the same time, the Turkish threat contributed to the consolidation of European states. France, England, and the German principalities strengthened their armies, improved military technology, and developed their economies. Competition with the Ottoman Empire stimulated progress in Europe. Interestingly, the fall of Byzantium indirectly contributed to the development of printing. The Greek manuscripts brought by the refugees needed to be reproduced and distributed. This created a demand for printed editions of ancient authors. Aldus Manutius in Venice specialized in publishing Greek texts. His printing house produced the first printed editions of Homer, Sophocles, and Aristotle. These books spread throughout Europe, making ancient wisdom accessible to a wide range of readers. Thus, the fall of Constantinople became a catalyst for many processes that shaped the modern world. The great geographical discoveries, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution. All these phenomena were directly or indirectly related to the tragedy of 1453.